Hi, I'm Dave Steele. I'm the CEO of Rock Point Oyster Company, and I'm here to show you a bit of a presentation of our nursery and how we grow baby oysters. Behind me is the starts of algae that we grow for food for the oysters. All the different colors represent different types of phytoplankton, diatoms, and so forth, and we start them out in these small flasks. And when the population, the density of algae gets to a certain point, we move it over into our larger carboys. The carboys, each color is a different type of algae or diatom, and we're pumping in oxygen and CO2 mix that helps keep the pH lower, and it feeds them, as well as a food mixture that we put in each cylinder, each carboy, as it helps the density grow. And the density will get to a certain point, and then it could crash if it gets too dense. But before it reaches that point, we move it outside to another part of our nursery. Out here, we have a lot larger cylinders that we move each one into. We'll inoculate each of these tanks, and they'll grow here for another week or so. Again, just the density of the algae or diatom builds up to a certain point, and then we move it into a larger feed tank. So this is a large tank that will grow it to the point where it's ready to feed to our baby oysters. And we have a variety of different types of food because each one has its own nutritional elements. That way we feed the baby oysters a good variety, and it keeps them healthier and stronger. We have some setting tables here. This tank would be used to feed the oysters. We pump in the algae and diatoms into that tank, and then it recirculates through all the babies, and they pump the food in. We have a table that's exposed over here that would have millions and millions of babies. We put roughly 5 million tiny oyster larvae in each of these tanks. To begin with, we'll put ground up oyster shell in each of these little, what we call a cylinder, and we grind it up and sieve it out to the point where each shell is a 1/2 millimeter in size, and we put a powder in the bottom on a screen, and then we purchase oyster larvae from a hatchery, either a hatchery in Quilcene nearby or down in Oregon, depending on the type of oyster that we want to grow at the time or what's available. And after about 2 days, those tiny oyster larvae will want to attach to the shell. And that's what's under the dark covers. We try to keep the sun off of them during the first few days so that they want to go down and find those bits of oyster shell. And each oyster will attach to its own shell, and they'll cement themselves to those little shell fragments. And as we feed them over the next 2 to 3 weeks, they grow to about 2 millimeters in size. In a week, they'll get to be about 3/4 of a millimeter, and then they double each week after that. At that point, we'll run them through a sieve and strain off all the excess shell and just have the oysters ready to move into our other part of the nursery, which we'll go across the road and look at that next. We'll move up to this building. So in this room, we have upwell tables. Back at the greenhouse, we were using a downwell system because the oysters are so tiny, we don't want them floating up out of the screens. So we put the water in on the top. But with this system, the water comes up from below, and this is all a feed system. So in this cylinder, we have millions and millions of little tiny babies. Now, this is a screen to keep any of them from washing away. And I can pull this up, and these have been in here for a couple of weeks. So they've been moved here a couple weeks ago from the greenhouse, and there's roughly 1 million little oysters in this. So these are all tiny little oysters at about 2 millimeter size right now. We'll grow them in these. We're still feeding them the algae, and we'll grow them in these until they're approximately 4 millimeters in size. And then they're large enough to survive eating natural food out in the bay. And these are quite a bit larger. So we can see that each one of these are getting to be about the size we would move them out into our bay nursery. So that's basically it. We grow these little individual oysters, and then they'll be moved out into the bay where we grow them to maturity and then ship them off to restaurants all over the country.